Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. There are dozens of lobbyists representing corporations and powerful interests at the Rhode Island State House, but the Economic Progress Institute prides itself on being the people's lobbyist. They advocate for laws that improve the lives of low and modest income Rhode Islanders. I'm here with their executive director, Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies, to talk about their wins and losses in this year's budget and their priorities for next year. Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ed. I'm so excited to be here.
So to start with, remind our listeners what the Economic Progress Institute is and how long you've been there.
So the Economic Progress Institute have been in Rhode Island for 25 years. And I like to think of us as the people's lobbyists. And it's interesting, I never thought of myself being a lobbyist. But the reason that's important is because at the State House, there's a lot of policies that are made, and low-income and moderate families do not have lobbyists that they pay to go and advocate for childcare and pay leave and wages. And so EPI was founded to make sure like those issues were not forgotten at the State House. So EPI show up at the State House and advocate on behalf of low and modest income Rhode Islanders to make sure fiscal investments are targeted towards those communities as well as policies. And then we back up our advocacy with research. So we pull data and research and provide reports to educate policymakers and communities about what the issues are and why certain policies need to be made. And then finally, EPI work in coalitions with all of these issues. And so we amplify our voices by working with coalitions across the state on different issues from paid leave, childcare, to cash assistance, to supporting small businesses, and do our work in that way to make sure there are more people talking about these issues.
I remember when I first started covering the State House, I covered the late Nancy Gewirtz, one of the co-founders of the group, up at the State House. And I think at the time it was called the Poverty Institute, right? Then why the name change?
So the name changed long before I came at EPI, but it changed because poverty was what we were fighting against, and it changed to economic progress, what we're fighting towards. And so I've been with EPI for about 2.5 years now, and I'm really loving the mission and the work we're trying to accomplish.
And I remember some legislators giving Nancy a hard time. You know, she would advocate for lower income people. And so I was curious, what's the atmosphere on Smith Hill like these days when you lobby for people who don't have a lot?
Right. So they'll still give me a hard time, but I kind of like it. I think we're a built-in relationship here. But the atmosphere, I think some legislators are open to understanding that they do have to represent the interests of all Rhode Islanders. So we do, part of our work is really building relationship. And so when I show up to the State House, my message to legislators are, this is not a got you movement. That's not why I'm here. I'm here so we can work together to solve the problems of Rhode Island. And so I try to present that on every issue we work to explain why it's important to make sure all of us thrive and why it's in the best interest of those who are representing us to pay attention to that. We have a lot of legislators that love working with EPI, love working with our coalition partners, reference our research a lot in the decisions they made. And there are some that we're still working on, but I'm sure we'll get there.
The Institute recently issued a review of the 2025 state budget and legislation enacted during this year's General Assembly session. So give us a few of the highlights.
So I'll give a little back to that.
Sure.
So when we started the year, we started with about 41 priorities that will promote economic justice in Rhode Island. By May, we have no idea whether even one of those priorities are going to go through. But in June, what we do is really to give an assessment of what happened with the budget and what happened with policies. So there were a few highlights we had. We had about 15 of the 41 priorities that sort of made it out of committee, made it onto the floor, and were enacted.
15 of the 41.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And we provided almost like 100 testimonies. So give you an idea of, how progress, goes forward at the State House. But there were some great, I have to say, significant investments this year. So I have to give a shout out to the Speaker, Senate leadership, and legislators that actually provided some investments towards low and moderate income.
Yeah, what was the biggest victory from your perspective?
So pay leave was a huge one for us. We did advocate to increase pay leave from 6 to 12 weeks, where most people are in other states that have pay leave. We didn't get 12 weeks, we got 8. That was a huge victory. The Secure Choice Retirement Savings Program, I think that was a big win for Rhode Islanders. And what that is that private sector employees who did not have access to retirement benefits now have a state-run retirement program that they can pay into. That's going to impact 172,000 Rhode Islanders. So that was huge. Save RIPTA campaign, EPI was invited in to that coalition to be a part of the support for that campaign. And they were advocating because there were service cuts towards RIPTA. The governor had proposed $10 million. It wasn't enough. Advocates asked for $18 million, and the legislators were able to pass about 15. So that, again, I think was huge to really protect public transportation in the state of Rhode Island.
Let's just go back to paid family leave for a second, because I remember the original bill, I think it was introduced by the Senate Majority Whip Valerie Lawson, called for doubling the number of weeks from 6 to 12, right?
Correct.
Senator Jonathan Acosta was really disappointed that it didn't double, that only went from 6 to 8 over the course of 2 years. And he pointed out that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, our Democratic vice presidential nominee, just signed legislation providing up to 12 weeks. So how come Minnesota's doing that and Rhode Island's not?
Right. And Connecticut and Massachusetts and most of our New England partner have 12 weeks. And so we're supposed to be that. And it's medically proven, and doctors come up and say, especially for parent bonding with a child, 12 weeks is the appropriate number of weeks. So I'm not sure what happened, because it passed out of the Senate at 12 weeks. We thought it was going to happen at 12. I don't know what happened with the negotiation. We landed at 8. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep pushing for the 12 weeks. But then also something that didn't come up this year was Rhode Island also only replaced wages at 60%. And so when you take paid leave, you basically get a 40% pay cut in Rhode Island. Massachusetts, Connecticut is up to 90 and 80%. And so that's another thing that next year will be back to not only increase their weeks, but also increase their wage replacement.
So this will be one of the Institute's priorities going into the next legislative session?
It will, for sure.
So the report also cited the $120 million housing bond that voters will be voting on in November. Where would that money go, and what's your message to voters about that?
Right. So it's supposed to go towards affordable housing. We have a housing shortage problem in Rhode Island. It's also supposed to go towards addressing homelessness issue. And so stabilization programs will benefit from that. And so my message to voters is this will be a good thing if it's used in the way it needs to be used. So we do have a lot of money, but we have to make sure there is a plan to ensure that there will be affordable housing. So voters should ask the question about where this money is going to go, and then make their vote based on where they think the investments will be.
And you talked about the $15 million that was invested in the Rhode Island Public Transit Agency. RIPTA did call off the service cuts that they had been talking about. Right. But what steps are needed to ensure this bus agency doesn't lurch just from one crisis to another?
Right. So first of all, the $50 million is temporary, right? So we use the ARPA funding to sort of put a band-aid on the problem. We need general revenue to sustain RIPTA over time. And beyond service cuts, we need a public transportation system that works. And so we have a transit master plan that talks about more routes to make sure more people can use RIPTA, have longer days of service. And so we actually need to think about what investment in RIPTA look like, and we need to put the revenue towards that.
Do you have a sense of how our public transit compares to other states?
Well, if we just compare again to our neighbor Massachusetts, we don't have a commuter rail or subway system. Our buses don't run as much as other places do. And then you have this of going to Kennedy Plaza and getting on the next bus to go to where you need to be. So there really needs to be a revamp of what will make the system work and convenient for riders.
So the next General Assembly session will start in January. What are some of the areas where you would like to see the legislature act?
So, we passed a $13.9 billion budget, and we love investments. EPI is all about investing in communities, but we know a budget is not balanced if you do not generate revenue. Rhode Island needs to be serious about how we generate revenue because we lost a lot of federal dollars after the pandemic. And so we want to think more with our policymakers about providing an equitable revenue stream that will allow millionaires to pay their fair share. So that's going to be one priority for us.
So the millionaire's surtax, right?
Correct.
Because Massachusetts implemented a millionaire's tax, and it raised $2.2 billion this year. What does that tell you?
It tells me that it works. And there's been some people who talk about an exodus of millionaires leaving the state. If that happens, we haven't seen such an exodus. People move in and out of states all the time. There's no data that show that every millionaire in the state will leave. And the fact that there's $2.2 billion in Massachusetts means there are some millionaires that are stayed and are finally paying their fair share.
Yeah, the Globe reported recently that the Massachusetts Society of Certified Public Accountants, the CPAs, had a survey that showed 2/3 of members reported at least one client who had moved away from Massachusetts last year. Do you think that indicates that it's scaring people away?
No. So, the background behind that is 120 CPAs were surveyed. 80 of them said at least one of their clients. Massachusetts have over 200,000 millionaires. So if you really look at what percentage of millionaires move, and taxes were one of many reasons that they cited. So that survey, I take that with a grain of salt.
Senate President Dominic Ruggiero was on the podcast at one point, and he warned that rich people would move out of the state if a millionaire's tax was enacted. What do you say to him?
I say to him, I think we have to push back on that narrative, right? First of all, you have lowest income Rhode Islanders paying more than their percentage in taxes versus the richest Rhode Islanders. That is unfair. That's one thing. Second, we need to generate revenue in our state. We have a Washington Bridge issue that doesn't seem to go away. You need revenue to deal with infrastructure, public transportation, education. I think his message to those millionaires that threaten to lead the state is to make Rhode Island better for all of us. We all need to do our part and encourage them to stay. And I will say to him that narrative of millionaires leaving for taxes is really not something that the data shows.
How much revenue would that tax raise, and what could it be used for?
This year, we estimated, and this was a conservative estimate, that just taxing about 2,000 millionaires in Rhode Island, we have generated $126 million. And that was a low estimate. We got reports from fiscal notes that might even have been closer to $180 million. And that we have been used for infrastructure, again, public transportation, childcare, and education.
We'll have more with Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. The Institute's report calls for action on so-called payday lending reform. And I remember in 2023, the House did vote for a bill that would cap the interest rates charged by the payday lenders, but the Senate didn't take up the legislation, and it didn't come up for a vote in the House or the Senate this year. So what's holding up that legislation? Is it simply that former House Speaker Bill Murphy opposes it? He's a lobbyist.
That is our assumption, because especially this year, we got support from all 5 statewide elected officers that signed a public letter. We got about 300 people from across the state saying we want this reform. And yet we still have this that we will not bring it to the vote. And so we've been pushing and saying, tell us a reason. I'm a lawyer by trade. We are data analysts. Tell us what your concerns are. We'll provide the data. We'll explain to you the facts. We did all of that this year. And so we're really thinking the barrier could be be because of the lobbyists, or the barrier could be because leadership is not bringing it to the floor. So we'll be back next year asking them to do the right thing and bring the votes to the floor.
And what do you say to the advocates for those facilities that say, well, it provides people with some short-term cash when it's not always available otherwise?
So there are options. There are options. Capital Good Fund provide those type of funds. Navigant Credit Union, Bank of America. There are actually options that do not prey on low-income communities. The military got rid of it. Our own Senator Reid proposed a bill that got rid of it. All of our New England neighbors have gotten rid of it. So people in other states are able to pay for car repairs. They are also able to do that here in Rhode Island without paying over 200% interest rates.
Your report also calls for the state to issue a budget equity statement and legislation equity impact statements. Explain what that would entail.
So other states and Connecticut have passed legislation requiring legislators to think about how their policies impact different communities. In Rhode Island, we still have disparities. So Black and Latino families cannot buy homes at the same rate as their white neighbors. Black and Latino children, again, are in poverty rates 2 times, 3 times more than their white counterparts. And so what equity impact statements does is to let legislators think about, if we're passing these policies, are we leaving behind certain communities, or are we bringing everyone along to make sure Rhode Island works for all? And so it's sort of a pause check to make sure we're not continuing to expand the disparity gap and racial wealth gap in Rhode Island, and we're doing all we can to close those gaps.
So can you give me an example of how it would measure the equity of a piece of legislation?
Right. So we actually this year and last year to provide an equity review of the governor proposed budget.
Okay.
And we provided examples of how that will work. We give 10 examples this year, but 6 of those bills were passed. So for example, the multilingual learners impact in Rhode Island, right? We have about 18,000 students who need language access help. The enacted budget had about $15 million in the budget going towards those students. So that is a way of how you measure equity to make sure students who have language access needs are able to get investment. So that's an example.
So why didn't that proposal go anywhere this year? The equity measurement, yeah.
I'm not sure. I think the word, we're in a climate now where the word equity, diversity, all of these words seems to scare people. But my pushback on that is, it makes us better as a nation. It makes us better as a state. We are diverse, whether we like to know that or not. And so it's in our best interest to do what we need to do. And I think people get a little nervous about, how to push forward and concerned about how that will work. And so we've been doing our due diligence to educate and provide examples and models of how that will work.
The report also mentions baby bonds.
Yes.
And I think that's a proposal that the state treasurer, James Diosa, has championed. What are baby bonds exactly?
What baby bonds will do will create a trust for children in Rhode Island who are born on Medicaid. So right now, the number that the general treasurer looked at was 4,600 children that would benefit from that. And it will be investing $3,000 this year, it had passed, on next year. And the return on investment is estimated to be about $15,000 when they become 18, and they can use that money towards higher education, buying a home, opening a business, and really setting them up for success.
And do other states have baby bonds?
Yes. So Connecticut has baby bonds, and a few other states have already started enacting them.
And did you get a sense of why that legislation didn't pass this year? Was there opposition?
So it was the first year we have introduced it in Rhode Island. So it's going to take a while for legislators to understand what it's going to do. And it costs money. And so we had a budget that you had to really balance what to invest in and what not to. And it's a long-term investment. So I think we just have to be prepared to come back next year and make the case for it.
And is the goal to just build generational wealth?
Correct. It's going to close the racial gap. So a lot of children born on Medicaid are low income, obviously, and children of color. And so it will close that gap and set them up to start building that generational wealth.
So what would you say, with the legislative session coming up in a few months, what would you say is the Institute's main goal for 2025?
Our main goal, I think, remains our goal for all the years we've been here, is really, again, to ensure that we have budgetary investments and policies that positively impact low and moderate income Rhode Islanders. And so I'm hoping we can work with policymakers to set an agenda for Rhode Island that works for all.
And how does the Economic Progress Institute measure success? I mean, how would you know if you are making a difference?
Yeah, so even looking at what had passed, like out of our 41, the 15 that passed, I look at who is impacting. We passed the full Medicaid reimbursement rate bill. And what that does, it impacts over 370,000 Rhode Islanders. So when I look at the number of people that now have access to medical providers, I look at the number of people that have access to retirement benefits, and those who have now 8 weeks access to paid leave and access to more child care benefits. That tells me that we are making progress.
Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport, Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.